has been invaluable in putting together this legislation, and so again I'd like to thank her and ask her for her comments.
Madam
Senator
President.
from Minnesota.
Thank you, Madam President. I'm introducing this bill today with Senator Hoeven, who's been a true leader on this issue way back to his time as a governor when he worked to pass a similar law in North Dakota. As Senator Hoeven just described, the Driver Privacy Act will strengthen safety and protect consumer privacy. And I think the bipartisan support that Senator Hoeven has gathered for this bill with 7 Republicans, 7 Democrats, and people all over the country from Hawaii to Georgia to Oregon to Alaska, not to mention the 2 of us from the middle of the country, demonstrates the strong support and the concerns that people have about emerging technology. And we want this technology, but I figure our laws have to be as sophisticated as the technology that we have out there. And right now our laws are lagging and this information is not protected, and there's really no roadmap on how it should be protected, and that's why we're introducing this bill. Madam President, I've long supported improving safety on our roadways. Too many people die on our highways, and we need to do something about it. In 2010, there were more than 30,000 fatal crashes and more than 1.5 million crashes that resulted in injuries. This is unacceptable. Rural road safety is a critical issue for my state as well as it is for Senator Hoeven's state. Only 23% of the country's population live in rural areas, and yet 57% of all traffic fatalities occur in rural America. As a member of the Senate Commerce and Transportation Committee, I've worked to advance efforts to improve safety for all drivers, especially on rural roads, and we've made some progress. The transportation bill, MAP 21, ensured strong funding for safety improvements at rail highway grade crossings, and the allocation of federal funding was improved to put resources into roadways that need attention the most. My amendment in MAP 21 with Senator Sessions required the Federal Highway Administration to work with state and local transportation officials to collect the best practices from around the country that are also cost-effective ways to increase safety on high-risk rural roads. The report was just released, and I'm now looking for opportunities for how we can best address some of the challenges addressed in the study, but it's clear we have more work to do. Vehicle technologies that assist drivers and prevent crashes have grown tremendously in recent years. From new sensors that identify unsafe conditions to driverless cars, these emerging technologies could dramatically increase safety for drivers and passengers. Event data recorders, that's the subject of our discussion today, hold similar promise in improving safety on our roadways. An EDR, as Senator Hoeven described, is a device that records data on a loop it receives from vehicle sensors and safety systems. The data is constantly being replaced, and it only records 5 seconds of technical safety information when a crash occurs, although I'm sure that could change when the technology changes. EDRs can be the only resource available to determine the cause of a crash by providing information about what a driver was doing in the seconds leading up to a crash, how fast the vehicle was going, whether the brake was activated in the seconds before the crash, if airbags were deployed, and whether the driver and passengers were wearing seat belts. As a former prosecutor, I know how useful this data can be. It can be very useful for investigators to put the pieces back together to more easily determine the cause of a crash for safety reasons, but also then who is the one that caused the crash. The proven benefits to driving safety that EDRs provide are not new. In the summer of 2012, the Senate included in its version of the transportation bill, MAP 21, a requirement that the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, NHTSA, initiate a rulemaking to require passenger vehicles and light-duty trucks to include EDRs. At the same time, there were many legitimate questions regarding the impact expanding EDRs to all passenger vehicles would have on consumer privacy. Who owns the data? Who can access the data? It became clear that an effective EDR provision would need to strengthen driver and vehicle safety while protecting consumer privacy, and the EDR provision was removed from the final transportation bill. Over the past 2 years, NHTSA has continued to work with law enforcement, safety groups, and the automobile manufacturers to ensure the safety benefits of EDRs which could reach the most consumers. The auto manufacturers had already begun expanding the inclusion of EDR technology in more new vehicles each year. EDRs became so commonplace that 96% of 2013 cars and trucks have the EDR built in, and NHTSA and the industry it regulates, the automakers, were able to agree that all new cars and trucks should have an EDR in place in September 2014. I'm not sure that everyone that goes out and buys a car is aware of this, but by 2014, every single car and truck will have this capability. NHTSA, though, does not have the authority to address the consumer privacy concerns related to EDRs that have remained outstanding for 2 entire years, as we've seen this enormous increase in new cars and trucks containing the EDRs. That's where Senator Hoeven comes in. Congress does have the authority to clarify ownership of EDR data, and that's why we are introducing the Driver Privacy Act along with 12 other senators. Our bill makes crystal clear that the owner of the vehicle is the rightful owner of the data collected by that vehicle's EDR, and it may not be retrieved unless a court authorizes retrieval of the data, the vehicle owner or lessee consents to the data retrieval, the information is retrieved to determine the need for emergency medical response following a crash, or the information is retrieved for traffic safety research, in which case personally identifiable information is not disclosed. So that's where you have it. And we worked hard with the safety groups and law enforcement to make sure that this would work for them. So you'd need a court authorization, or you need a consent, or you need a determination that it's needed to determine the cause of a crash, or it's needed for research, and in that case, no identifiable data. This was really important for me as a former prosecutor, that we made this work for law enforcement and our safety groups. But most importantly, our goal was to make it work for the individual consumers, the citizens of the United States of America, because we realized, well, all this was done for good intentions. No one had really taken the broom behind and made sure that the American people were protected. Having just left a judiciary hearing this afternoon about NSA collection and data collection and privacy and civil liberties, it was very timely that I came over here. Well, this may not quite have the huge ramifications of that hearing. I do think to myself that if maybe people had thought ahead a little bit, we wouldn't have been sitting in that hearing. That's what we are trying to do with this bill. We're trying to think ahead so we keep up with the technology so it doesn't beat us out and it doesn't beat our constitutional rights out. I've seen firsthand, Madam President, the devastating effects automobile crashes can have on families as they're forced to say goodbye to a loved one much too early. Oftentimes, the families just want answers. They want to know what happened and why. EDRs can help provide those answers. Our bill accounts for those needs of law enforcement and these families. And you don't have to take my word for it. The International Association of Chiefs of Police has concluded that the Data Privacy Act would not cause any additional burden to law enforcement agencies in accessing the data that they need. Advancements in technology oftentimes force us to take a look at related laws to ensure that they remain in sync. Senator Hoeven and I are introducing the Driver Privacy Act to do just that. Our bill strikes that balance between strengthening consumer privacy protections while recognizing that EDR data will be required to aid law enforcement, advance vehicle safety objectives, or to determine the need for emergency medical response following a crash. I want to thank Senator Hoeven for his leadership. He is a true bipartisan leader. We have worked together on many, many bills and worked together. I always say the Red River may technically divide our states, but it actually brings us together, whether it's about flood protection measures or whether it's about important bills like this. So I appreciate the opportunity to work with him on this bill. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Senator from North Dakota.
Thank the senator from Minnesota, Senator Klobuchar. Thanks for joining me on this legislation and working to really develop a great group of 14 original co-sponsors. And she brings such a great background as a prosecutor in the law enforcement industry and truly understands the law enforcement issues, the safety issues, and the informational benefits that go with event data recorders, but also understands very well the need to protect individual privacy. And as I think we've both said very clearly here on the Senate floor, this is a technology that is new and evolving. And it's not just that this is a new evolving technology where new capabilities are being added all the time, and we don't know what, you know, what additional capabilities will be added. But now the federal government is requiring that this device be in every single automobile made. So when the federal government, U.S. Department of Transportation, NHTSA, the safety branch of U.S. DOT, steps up and says, okay, we're going to require that this device be in every single car, we need to make sure that we're also providing the privacy that goes with it that assures our citizens that their Fourth Amendment rights will be protected. And I think, again, the senator from Minnesota makes a really great point when we look at some of these areas in terms of whether it's NSA, IRS, or other areas where people feel there wasn't enough work done on the front end to protect their personal privacy, and so we're in a catch-up situation. Let's not do that when every single citizen, you know, across this country owns, or their family owns, or, you know, has access to some type of automobile. And that's what we're trying to do. And again, as the technology develops, we need to understand what the ramifications are and how to protect privacy. And I think on behalf of both of us, you know, we're appreciative that we've got 14 senators engaged already, and we look to add, and we're open to ideas on making sure this is the right kind of legislation that both that addresses safety, but ultimately protects the privacy of our citizens. With that, Madam President, I yield the floor. Madam President, I note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Senator from Utah.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent to suspend the quorum call.
Without objection.
Madam President, I stand before this body today to talk about the omnibus spending package that the Senate will be considering over the next few days. I have some concerns related to this omnibus spending package that relate to a program called PILT. It's an acronym with which most Americans and probably even most members of Congress are not familiar. It stands for Payment in Lieu of Taxes. The program was developed so as to help those states, including my home state of Utah, in which the vast majority of the land is owned by the federal government. Beside me is a map of the United States. In red, you can see all the land that is owned by the federal government. As you can see by looking at the map, most of the land west of the Rocky Mountains, more than 50%, in fact, is owned by the federal government. Very, very little of the land east of the Rocky Mountains is, by contrast, owned by the federal government. Being from a public land state presents some interesting, some very significant, some very substantial challenges. Among those challenges is the fact that the federal government has deemed this land, has legislated this land as being beyond the ability, beyond the authority of states and their political subdivisions, including counties, local taxing jurisdictions, beyond the ability of the states and their subdivisions to tax. So we can't collect property tax revenue from any of that land. As a result, a lot of our communities in public land states are impoverished, at least impoverished relative to what they might otherwise face. They're impoverished relative to what their ability would be to collect revenue through property taxes in public land states. For that reason, this PILT program was created to try to offset, at least to some degree, the heavy costs, the disproportionate burden that is placed on the shoulders of public land states and communities. So each year, Congress funds this program, and that program then partially offsets the lack of property tax revenue flowing through these public land states and communities. Here's the problem that I'd like to focus on today. The omnibus spending package that we're considering this week contains no funding for PILT. No funding whatsoever. This is potentially devastating to public land states, including Utah, Wyoming, Alaska, Montana, and many other states, especially those throughout the West. The problem is that America's public land states and counties can't wait any longer. This program must be funded, and it must be funded in this bill. Now, here's a letter from a commissioner in Piute County, Utah. This commissioner states as follows. He says, PILT not being funded in 2014 will have a devastating impact on all counties in the West. But it's particularly devastating to a county the size of Piute, with 74% of Piute County under federal control. $225,000 of our $1 million budget, almost one-fourth, comes in the form of PILT payments from the federal government. Without this funding, we will be in the midst of one of the biggest disasters to hit Piute County in years. We've been scraping and scraping to try and figure out how we can fund a fourth deputy sheriff in our county. And we thought we had it figured out until this $225,000 evaporated from our county's revenue. At the present time, it is virtually impossible to staff all the police, search and rescue and emergency services we need. With this cut, it will be impossible. The Piute County Commissioner continues, we will be forced to abandon services, including all services on public lands. It'll be sad to have our public lands left without police, search and rescue and emergency services. I think it's critical to understand that the loss of PILT funding cuts clear to the bone and will be devastating to counties such as Piute, close quote. Now, some argue, some insist, when faced with arguments like this, that this is all okay and that we can just wait to make PILT funding available. We'll make it available through another legislative vehicle that we will supposedly pass later this year. In fact, some of these same people maintain, we'll make it better, we'll make it automatic, we'll make it mandatory spending when we actually do this later this year. Now, it is true that between 2008 and 2013, PILT was funded through a mandatory spending mechanism. That has now expired. But it's important to remember that there's nothing mutually exclusive about these ideas. No reason why we can't go ahead and fund PILT now with discretionary spending and then adopt something later to restore the mandatory nature of funding for PILT. We can fund PILT now in this bill, and then we can make it mandatory later. We can and we should. This would give states and counties the certainty that they need, the certainty that they've been waiting for, the certainty that will allow them finally to plan their budgets. Remember, for many of these counties, like Piute County, Utah, PILT is a substantial portion of their annual revenue stream. It's about 1/4 of the money that Piute County, Utah has to spend every single year. Importantly, I offered an amendment to last year's budget, an amendment that would build a deficit-neutral reserve fund to make sure that PILT continued to be fully funded. That amendment passed. Unfortunately, the fact that it passed has apparently not been enough to make sure that it continued to be funded. Now, we have a major funding bill before us. This spending bill occupies no fewer than 1,582 pages. It spends in excess of $1.1 trillion, and yet PILT still isn't funded. It's important to point out here that even if we do the right thing, and even if we fully fund PILT in this program this year, the PILT program is itself still not adequate. It's still in need of reform. You see, PILT payments are quite insufficient. PILT was intended to soften the economic impact associated with the federal government owning so much of the land in the United States. In the case of Piute County, it's about 3/4 of the land. It's about 2/3 of the land throughout the state of Utah. In some counties in Utah, it's well in excess of 90, sometimes 95% of the land in a county. PILT was designed to soften that economic impact. But regrettably, the federal government gives states, through the PILT program, what amount to, in many, many instances, only pennies on the dollar of what the taxing jurisdictions would receive if they were to tax that land, if they were to collect taxes, even if they were to collect those taxes at the lowest property tax rate, let's say the Greenbelt rate in many counties. We must correct that imbalance. And in the coming days, I plan to introduce legislation to begin the process of doing precisely that. After all, it makes no sense to have a program that we, some would argue, deceptively entitle payment in lieu of taxes, if, in fact, the payment in lieu of taxes doesn't even closely approximate the value that counties would receive if they were actually allowed to tax that land and collect that revenue as taxes. If an American, a U.S. taxpayer, for example, decided to adopt his or her own PILT program, and on April 15th of each year just sent a check to the IRS saying, these are not my taxes, but this is my payment in lieu of taxes. I'm just paying what I feel like paying. That would cause problems. The taxpayer in question would probably end up in prison. In any event, it wouldn't end well for the taxpayer. And yet we've allowed the federal government to get away with this over and over and over again, often to the detriment of vulnerable communities, of poor communities, of communities that rely on the federal government's unsteady stream of revenue, a stream of revenue that, insufficient as it is already, is now being threatened altogether. In a sense, the problem that we face with the federal government owning all this land is not new. It's a problem that's been around for a long time. In many respects, it was a problem envisioned by some of the founding fathers. In fact, we can go all the way back to the Constitutional Convention of 1787 and see that it was on the minds of some of the founding fathers. On September 5th, 1787, at the Constitutional Convention, they were discussing the public land-related authorities in the Constitution, including the authority that has now been included in what's often referred to as the Enclave Clause, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17. One of the delegates to the Federal Convention of 1787, Elbridge Gerry, a delegate from Massachusetts, stood before the convention and made an astute observation. Mr. Gerry said as follows. He expressed concerns that, quote, this power, that is the power of Congress over federal public lands, might be made use of to enslave any particular state by buying up its territory, and that the strongholds proposed would be a means of awing the state into an undue obedience to the general government, close quote. Then as now, wise observations often came from the state of Massachusetts. Then as now, we have a grave risk associated with the fact that when the federal government owns this much land, the federal government has this much power. And it was on the minds of the delegates to the convention of 1787 that one of the things they needed to protect against was the concentration of too much power in the hands of the few, especially the concentration of too much power within the federal government. They understood, and each of them had a mission to protect the sovereignty of their respective states. And they understood that if Congress had too much power to simply buy up too much land in any one state, disproportionately in some states, the federal government would have too much influence within that state. Now, I would ask you, when you look at this map, does that look equitable? Does that look like an equitable distribution of federal land ownership? I mean, we have to keep in mind that just as there are benefits associated with some of our public lands, there are also burdens attached to those benefits. And when you look at those burdens, it's difficult to say anything other than that they are disproportionately allocated into a certain region of the United States. They're overwhelmingly located within the Rocky Mountains and areas west of the Rocky Mountains. And so to the extent that these benefits benefit everyone in the United States, then the burdens ought to be shared by everyone in the United States as well. And yet they are not. PILT, again, is woefully inadequate as it is. But now Congress is trying to withdraw funding for PILT. And even though some may say, well, we'll fund it later this year, we have no guarantee of that. And we should be funding it right now. As an interesting side note, in response to Elbridge Gerry's concern on September 5th, 1787, the Founding Fathers put a qualifying clause into Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17. They said that Congress's plenary legislative jurisdiction over federal public land lying within a sovereign state's boundaries would exist and could be exercised only if that land, the land in question, was acquired by the consent of the host state's legislature. Some have suggested that this may well mean that when the federal government owns land, when it acquires land within a sovereign state's territorial boundaries, that it owns that land just as any other proprietor would own it. That is, subject to the authority of the state and its political subdivisions to tax and regulate that land, unless or until such time as the host state's legislative body parts with that bundle of sovereign rights relative to that land. In other words, the state retains its taxing power over that land unless or until it voluntarily relinquishes it, gives it up, hands it over to the federal government. And yet, in nearly all instances where you see red on this map, that has not occurred. Now, many of these states have been content with the fact that they've been receiving PILT funds, however inadequate those PILT funds may be. But now even those are going away. And even if there is a promise that they might be restored later this year, they're still inadequate, and we still don't have the promise that that's going to occur now. There's still a lot of uncertainty in a lot of parts of the country, places like Piute County, Utah, and elsewhere within my state and elsewhere within the western United States. In order to protect against this kind of concern, the kind of concern that the delegate from Massachusetts described on September 5th, 1787, Congress adopted a practice when admitting new states into the Union of incorporating language into the enabling acts for each new state, describing what would happen to public land within the new state's boundaries after statehood. They adopted this practice and this set of language that would be used each time a new state was admitted into the Union. That language was included in Utah's statehood enabling legislation that was adopted about 18 months before Utah finally came into the Union in January of 1896. Section 9 of Utah's enabling legislation says that public land located within the state, lying within the state of Utah, quote, shall be sold by the United States subsequent to the admission of said state into the Union. Adding to that, Section 9 of Utah's enabling legislation said that 5% of the proceeds from the sale of that land would be given to the state and would be held in a trust fund by that state for the benefit of the state's public education system. So, as I mentioned, Utah was not the first state to have that kind of language in its enabling legislation. Many of the states that were admitted into the Union much, much earlier than Utah had similar language in their enabling acts. Missouri had such language. North Dakota had such language. We can name state after state after state that had language like that. And when you look at Missouri, and when you look at North Dakota, and when you look at most of the other states that had language like that in their enabling acts, you see very little federal public land. You see, because Congress and the federal government honored the promises made to those states. Congress followed through with that commitment. Congress did what it was supposed to do. It sold that land subsequent to statehood, holding on perhaps to a few parcels here or there that it deemed necessary for one reason or another. It made good on that promise. Those states benefited, the federal treasury benefited, the American people benefited. Now, it's important to remember that what we're talking about here, when you see all of this red land representing federal land ownership, we're not talking about national parks. National parks represent a very tiny percentage of federal land ownership. We're not talking about national monuments, which also represent a very tiny, tiny percentage of federal land ownership. What we're talking about in the context of the PILT program are lands that are managed by the United States Bureau of Land Management, an agency that's considered obscure, almost unheard of throughout most of the United States, but an agency that operates with a particularly dominant force in states like mine, where you see a lot of red. I remember the first time that I showed this map to my children. My daughter Eliza, who was about 8 years old at the time, was just barely old enough to understand what I was explaining to her. I told her that the red indicated ownership of land by our national government. And 8-year-old Eliza looked at that portion of the map that represented our state, and she said, "Look, Dad, they own Utah." And I said, "You're right, Eliza, they own Utah. They certainly own the overwhelming majority of it." Some of us have not forgotten this promise made in the statehood enabling acts of most of the states admitted into the Union. And yet, Congress seems to be determined to overlook it. I'm determined not to let that happen. Some of my friends back in Utah are likewise determined not to let that happen. A good friend of mine, Representative Ken Ivory, who serves in the Utah State Legislature, has done an amazing job educating people throughout Utah and, in fact, across America on this very subject, on what happened with these statehood enabling acts and why it is that the states in the western United States got left behind when it came to promises made long ago by the federal government. I commend Representative Ivory for his work on this and pledge to continue working with him on this important project. You see, this is about much, much more than land. This is about the ability of local communities not only to thrive, but to survive. This is about communities where it's very, very difficult for people to get jobs. It's very difficult for people, in some instances, even to access their own property, even to access their own farms, because it's impossible to get anywhere without crossing federal public land. And in some instances, federal land managers will block access to the only roads that they can use to access their own property. This has to stop. In the meantime, it's vitally important that we focus on the issues at hand, that we focus at a bare minimum on promises that the federal government has extended in lieu of the other promises. That is not to say that we're going to forget about the promises made in the Statehood Enabling Acts. We're not. But for the moment, my attention remains focused on making sure that we fund the PILT program. It's got to be funded. And in fact, it's got to be funded even more than it has been in the past. It ought to reflect at least a rough equivalent of the amount of money that the taxing jurisdiction could collect if it were taxing that land at its lowest rate. And at a bare minimum, even below that, we've got to make sure that the program continues to exist. We've got to make sure that the program is funded, at least at its current levels. This is not asking much, but it is necessary that we do this. The broken PILT program is, one could argue, just another example of government applying significant and unnecessary weights to the shoulders of hardworking Americans, many of whom are struggling just to get by, many of whom are barely able to keep food on the table for their families, others of whom are able to provide for the day-to-day needs of their families, but they're worried about what happens next. They find that whenever they find a little bit of additional income, no sooner have they earned it than they find that it's been swallowed up. Swallowed up by increasing taxes, swallowed up by higher prices for goods and for services, and they don't know how to get out of this rut in which they find themselves somewhat trapped. These are the kinds of people who suffer the most as a result of the federal government's failed policies relative to its federal public land. And we have to remember that lifting these weights is not only within the government's power, it is the affirmative obligation of government to lift those weights. In an 1861 address to Congress, President Abraham Lincoln said that the leading object of American government was, quote, to elevate the condition of men, to lift artificial weights from all shoulders, to clear the paths of laudable pursuit for all, to afford all an unfettered start and a fair chance in the race of life, close quote. Current PILT policy imposes government weights that make it more difficult for communities to provide important services like schools, police, and fire departments. It hampers states' abilities to budget and plan and provide for infrastructure improvements, make needed reforms to their tax systems, and attract new businesses and new jobs. This policy and the federal land management policies that accompany the PILT policy more generally is broken, and it's imposing a heavy burden on our communities, particularly in rural areas where the federal government owns much or most, or in some cases nearly all, of the land, and where the needs are at their very greatest. The program is already broken. The program is already causing millions and millions of Americans to suffer. The program is already severely impeding economic opportunity for Americans, deepening the existing crisis of opportunity that we have in this country, which manifests itself on 3 different levels: immobility among the poor, insecurity among the middle class, and cronyist privilege at the top. You see, if you live in one of these states, it might be great if you're one of those people who owns one of the few parcels of land that's not owned by the federal government. It's not so great if you live in one of those areas where the federal government owns basically everything, where you can do very, very little anywhere around you without permission from the federal government, and where your local government is barely able to survive because it lacks a property tax base and the federal government fails adequately to fund PILT and threatens, in this circumstance, to withdraw funding from PILT altogether. Madam President, I respectfully implore all of my colleagues to consider the inequities inherent in this map, the inequities inherent in the PILT program, and for present purposes, to remember that we need to fund PILT. It's got to be reformed, absolutely. And we've got to examine our federal land ownership and management policies more broadly. Today, we need to focus on making sure that PILT is funded. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
During this quorum call, an update on what's happened in the Senate today. Today, members blocked an amendment to the long-term unemployment extension bill that would extend unemployment benefits through November. The vote was 52 to 48. Members then blocked the underlying bill that would extend long-term unemployment benefits by just 3 months, and that vote was 55 to 45. It is unclear when the chamber will again take up work on this measure. The House, in the meantime, has passed measures aimed at keeping the government open past January 18th, while members continue to work on an omnibus spending bill to fund the government through the rest of fiscal year 2014. Senator Barbara Mikulski, Maryland, spoke on the Senate floor shortly about the Senate's progress in that regard, and we spoke to a Capitol Hill reporter about this. We'll show you that now.
As Congress begins consideration of the fiscal year 2014 omnibus spending bill, we're joined by Eric Wasson of The Hill. What are some of the top-line details we should know about this bill?
Well, this spending bill is about $1 trillion in total. It's $1.012 trillion. It fleshes out the details of the Ryan Murray Budget Pact that passed Congress in December. This is a true bipartisan compromise. The negotiators worked all the way until Sunday evening to hash out policy differences throughout the federal government's budget, and it includes compromises on what were originally 134 policy riders. These are policy limitations on everything from preventing the post office from discontinuing Saturday mail, that's in the bill, to preventing the Export-Import Bank from blocking funds for coal plants overseas. That was an important priority for House Appropriations Committee Chairman Hal Rogers. That's in the bill. There are other things that were not in the bill. There's no provision blocking all funding for Obamacare. That's the issue that shut down the government for 16 days in October. However, conservatives can point to the fact that $1 billion has been taken out of the Obamacare Prevention Fund, which they've often derided as a slush fund that Health and Human Services Secretary Sebelius can dip into to bolster Obamacare funding. And overall, Obamacare funding is held at the post-sequestration level, so there's no new funding for Obamacare.
Well, 2014, an important year for U.S. efforts in Afghanistan. How does the omnibus handle war funding?
Well, war funding is at $92 billion, which is on the high end. That's what the House was seeking, and this will help the Pentagon deal with what is a funding cut. It's about $20 billion in base funding reduction from what the House had sought. So it was a pretty strong number. Aid to the Afghan government, however, is limited. There are policy provisions which would require bilateral security agreement in order for full funding to the Afghan government. And additionally, in that section, there is also new limitations on aid to Egypt as well, which saw a coup and its funding limited by the administration, and now it will have to meet certain democracy objectives to receive its full military assistance as well.
And you reported on some language in the bill changing or reverting back to some of the benefits that were taken away, the military benefits. Tell us more about that.
That's right. The Ryan Murray budget deal cut about $85 billion in spending over 10 years in order to boost spending in the near term on the discretionary side. And how they got to that overall cut involved a cut to military pensions of about $6 billion. This is the cost of living adjustment for military retirees, and it's proven quite controversial even among normally deficit hawks on the Republican side, and there's a big effort in the Senate by Democrats and Republicans to reverse that. This bill does not completely reverse the pension cut. Instead, it just addresses how it affects disabled veterans and survivors of members of the military who have been killed or who have died while in service. This would exempt them from the cut, and that is part of this deal.
Well, on to the politics of getting this through the House and Senate. First, the House, you tweeted earlier about Republican leaders saying that the leaders are starting to sell the $1 trillion omnibus to the rank and file. How are they going about doing that?
Well, that's right. Already there was talk about it in this morning's conference meeting among House Republicans. They're really pointing out that this is bringing discretionary funding back to the last year of the Bush administration before the Obama stimulus. It's a lower number than was in one of the first Paul Ryan budgets, and they're emphasizing that there are a lot of conservative principles, including on Obamacare, as I mentioned, that are in here and worth going for. A lot of the members have just started to review the bill. It's 1,582 pages. It dropped at 8 p.m. last night, so when I was talking to them, they were still reviewing it, and some of them have very local concerns. You know, Representative Jason Chaffetz, a true conservative, but someone who also can side with leadership when it makes sense for him, was concerned about a land provision, payment in lieu of taxes that relates to rural communities and payments to local government. So people are bringing up individual pieces of the bill that they're worried about and talking to leaders about how that might be addressed in other legislative vehicles. So there's a real conversation going on, and there'll be a whip check during today's votes, which start early in the afternoon.
Well, on the Democratic side, with the administration, you report supporting the omnibus spending measure. Does that make it easy for House Democrats to go ahead and favor the bill?
I think so. I think there'll probably be a strong House Democratic vote. Steny Hoyer, the minority whip who opposed the budget deal because it didn't do enough to create a grand bargain to deal with long-term deficits, has said he will support this measure. So I think there's going to be a strong vote, but we're still, talking to members and seeing if they have concerns. There are cuts to, National Institutes of Health funding and certain programs, especially in the Education Department, that may deter some, especially liberal members, from voting for it.
Read more from Eric Wasson at thehill.com and follow him on Twitter at ELWasson. Thanks for the update.
Thanks so much for having me.
Again, the Senate in a quorum call after having blocked an amendment to extend unemployment.
I come to the floor this early evening.
Excuse me, Senate is in quorum call.
I ask the quorum call be suspended.
Without objection.